Hi, I have a take two with Therese video for old and new here today, and this is a stamp highlight video using this beloved Daisy stamp set, which comes with some coordinating dies and a mask stencil. And I'm going to make two completely different cards today, other than that they're using the same stamp sets and the same colour inks. They're going to look totally different. So I'm starting by creating like a watercolory background, and I'm actually using some Bristol Smooth cardstock here because I want the colours to sit well on the cardstock, and I don't want to have to worry too much about how much water I'm adding. If I used normal cardstock, you wouldn't be able to see it. And when I talk about seeing, what I like to do is actually stamp each image and add the embossing powder before I stamp the next image. That way I can see where they are. Now, I did want one of my stems to be behind the images, so I actually heat embossed my whole panel except for one of the stems. And how I got around this is I actually just stamped it straight over top of all of my embossed images because they have cooled down a little bit now. That was me testing the heat. And then I can just wipe away the excess ink, which really didn't work at all. But what I did was wipe away the excess powder. And I just used a soft paintbrush to do that. You could actually hit it with your heat tool. It will remelt, but you might see some ridges. So I found it was easier to actually stamp and heat emboss this after I'd removed the excess powder. And that seemed to work real well. All right, I'm using some of the newer ink colors today. So these beautiful, they're kind of like yellowy orangey color, and the pinks that were released recently, and really pretty colors, but they don't play well together. So what I like to do is initially I'm using a couple of different tones of the yellow, and I'm actually not waiting for this to dry in between. I'm using the smooshing technique. So I've got my palette, I'm adding my ink pad directly to the palette, giving it a spritz with some water, picking up with some acetate, and then just laying it over the image. When I change to a different colour, I wait for it to dry in between. I'm not using a heat tool. This took quite a while to do. I just kept coming back to it over time. It didn't take a long time to dry each time, but it was worth it. Better than getting a muddy brown. Speaking of which, I added brown. This is hazelnut. I just thought it needed a bit more depth, and so what I did was come in with the green near the base of the panel. This is the magenta, is the last color I added, which was very bright, and it did tend to stain the white embossing powder. So I think I just didn't wipe it away quick enough, but I actually used a little alcohol wipe and a dry cloth to remove that from the white embossing powder, and that seemed to work okay. I've got a sentiment here today. It's from the Weekend Doodles stamp set, and I wanted it to be almost like a ombre two-tone effect. So I've stamped the top line of the sentiment and a portion of the bottom, just wherever the ink pad hit. I wasn't being too fussy, but I have actually, for the top portion of the sentiment, just used a post-it note to mask it off before I added my pink. And then I do have to remove the post-it note before I stamp. And this is where a positioning tool like the Misty comes in so handy. I didn't have to line up the stamps again, and I didn't have to mix my inks on the stamps, so there's no chance of contamination. Now I've got a landscape side fold card, and I'm using lots of glue tape to adhere my panel to the front because it is a watercolor cardstock. It was wet. There is a little bit of warping, but minimal actually, really, considering. And I've added a simple white frame from the Fine Frames cover die. I adhered that on an angle, and I did use some matte medium because of the embossing, the heat embossing. I just knew that was going to hold nice and strongly, and I popped up my sentiment. How pretty are these colours? It's kind of like that purple and orange. No, the pink and orangey, purpley, orangey pink. I do like those brights together. It's so pretty. On my second card, this is going to look totally different, but I am using the same stamp set. So I've got the mask stencil this time, and I'm using my blending brushes. I've been practicing and I think I'm getting better. I can get a lot paler colour, and I feel like I've got a little bit more control of the brush. And I was given the tip to kind of tap my brush off to the side on a scrap piece of paper by a very clever crafter, thank you very much. And that really does seem to help with less lines in the blended results. So I was really happy with how smoothly that came out. I love that you get the positive and the negative in these mask stencils. They just are invaluable, and I'm using them all the time. So I did decide to stamp layer the daisies, and I used the same pinks and oranges and greens that I used on the first card, and this is a very forgiving set to stamp layer. And I know some people really struggle with actually lining up the images as you layer them, but the guide is on the back of the packet, and that's what I'm looking at. And because there are no outlines in this particular stamp set, I didn't feel like I had to be as specific where I stamped. And they actually, I love the way how they turned out so bright. And I just altered the centers of the flowers to the opposite color of the flower that I stamped. And then I also did stamp out some stems and also a couple of leaf images, and then I actually die cut the whole lot of them out using the coordinating dies. These bright flowers, they just make me happy. I did come in and actually add a couple of layers, or just one layer actually, to the base images on my card front. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do initially, and I'm glad that I did. It just gave them a bit of extra depth. This sentiment, it's from the same set from the Weekend Doodles, and I've heat embossed that with some white embossing powder on some parchment cardstock, and I'm die cutting that out with one of the little Handmade Tags die, because I want this to be to make a bouquet of flowers that looks like you're going to be giving to someone. And then I just popped up all my flowers. I used some pop dots. I didn't make them too high. It's kind of like a one layer card, but not really, obviously, because it's got the flowers popped up. But the base images are all on the actual card front itself, which I often don't do. Generally speaking, I'll stamp and do I'll actually add a panel to the front of my card, but this time I was very daring and actually stamped, no I didn't, mask stenciled on the front of my card. And then I just used my glue tape and the pop dots for the rest of my images, and I have some pink twine that I've made like a double bow with, and I've using my matte medium there to adhere that to my tag and to the stems of the flowers. And I think something like this would make a really good Mother's Day card. And these flowers, they're so pretty. So I'll link everything in the description below, and don't forget to like this video if you like it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's always heaps of inspiration here. Bye.